Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the 97 UX Things podcast. Dan Berlin here, your host and book editor. This week, I am joined by Michael Hawley, who wrote the Assess Usefulness and Desirability Early in Product Development chapter. Thanks for joining me, Mike.
Thanks, Dan. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I've been in UX for a few years now, and I'll get to that more in a second. But currently, I am serving as VP of Experience Research and Strategy at 0 Degrees, which is a UX professional services consultancy.
Hmm.
And as a side gig, I also teach in the Human Factors and Information Design program at Bentley University
Hmm.
for generally UX students. So try to stay pretty active in the community and glad to be here.
Great. Great. Well, thanks for joining me. And let's just start off with hearing about folks' UX trajectory. So, how did you discover UX and how did you wind up where you are today?
Well, probably like a lot of people doing UX before it was called UX or kind of learning that there was a thing. My undergraduate degree actually is in cellular molecular biology, which is not much to do with UX directly. But at the
Right.
time, I knew I didn't want to work in a lab, just mixing test tubes all the time. So I got a job out of college, and it was in software. This was early '90s, and software for hospitals. And my job was to go around the country and be that liaison and trainer for what was going on in the back office and the software that was
Mm,
being developed, and
yep.
then actually working with the people who were going to use it. It was before I even knew what UX was or before it was really popular, but I was developing a sense of empathy for people
Mm,
and using things and seeing the juxtaposition between what somebody actually does in the field and using a piece of software or an experience versus what people back in the office were thinking they were doing and
right.
developing things. So, and I remember one story very vividly. Part of my job was to travel around to different hospitals and help them on the go live date, right? When they were switching from their paper system or from some other package. And so I would be there to help people manage the software, make sure that they knew what they were doing. And I was doing rounds, checking in with everybody, making
Yep.
sure that they knew what to do. And I got to one of these nursing stations, and there was a nurse who was really breaking down,
Oh,
almost crying, because she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to figure out the software and she would lose her job because of it.
oh,
And
wow.
so, talk about a very acute kind of experience of
Hmm.
user UX at that point. And so that really started me on my path of developing that empathy for people and seeing the impact of our designs on real humans, real people.
Yep.
So that got me really exposed to the impact of designs on people actually using them.
Hmm.
So from there, got caught up in the dot com boom a little bit and worked for some software companies. And at that point, uh, I found myself sticking with the product management side of things and being that middle between the developers and the people making decisions about the software and the customers. And at that point, I learned about and UX was growing as a field and got involved in it. Went to school, and from there, kind of took off with it. So I was lucky to be involved and learn from some of the people who started some of the original thinking around usability testing, user experience processes, and learn from them. So, um, I spent a couple years in working at a as an innie within a company working on products, but the most of my career has now been with professional services as an outie,
Yep.
working from the outside. So.
Great. Great. And are you concentrating in any particular domain these days, or any specific area that you like to focus on?
Well, it's an interesting juxtaposition with professional services because clients and companies need you to bring a diversity of experience and a
Mm,
variety of different perspectives and bring best practices from other industries to theirs. But you also need to balance. Um, you need to have some level of depth of understanding of the trends or the considerations in any one given industry. So I find myself working with a lot of, let's say, post login experiences in healthcare and education, technology, those types of things. So less on
Mhm.
the marketing communication side, more on when you need to develop a long term relationship with a customer and interact with them over time. There's a lot of commonalities in that across industries. So I
Yep.
find myself working with that.
Yep. One of the things that you said resonated there. One of the things I love most about agency life and consulting is when you learn about a particular domain, there are certain things that you can bring to folks in other domains that they may not have considered at all. That could positively affect their customers' experience, but they just never came near to thinking about it because it's not in their domain.
Yeah, it is a fine balance.
It is.
Yeah, you need to show expertise and have a background in and understand, like, what are HIPAA regulations in healthcare.
Yep.
What do people think about in financial services? How does financial well being play in? You have to have some sense of the trends in an industry, but bringing other perspectives is helpful,
Hmm.
and clients really look for that. I
Indeed.
enjoy the professional services side of it.
Yep.
Yep.
Likewise. Great. So thanks for that. Moving on to your chapter. So can you tell us about your chapter?
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of background of how I even thought about this. And I know you and I, Dan, have been talking about this
Right.
topic for a long time.
Quite some time.
Yeah, having worked in professional services, you know, people come to an agency or consultant not necessarily to just advance an existing product over time, but really for new ideas, for new opportunities, for something to break through and be innovative and unique. And so
Yep.
we get to work on those types of things a lot. And so, in that process, we're very early on thinking about doing formative research
Mm.
with customers and target audience members, um, and you're really trying to suss out between different ideas which ones might work, which ones are going to be most compelling to the target audience, which ones are going to be the most valuable and most useful potentially in their lives. And so, you know, you and I, our default reaction is to say, well, let's sit down with people one on one, right?
Right.
And talk about the ideas that we have and see if they might resonate. And when we say sitting down and talking to people one on one, that looks a whole lot like a usability test,
Right.
right? But I think about the people who I learned from in terms of usability testing, and I was very fortunate to work with, let's say, Joe Dumas, who helped kind of write usability testing protocols in the
Sure.
early days, or Beth Loring, who you and I both know,
Yep.
or I would follow Jacob Nielsen and other people who were very much into the practice of usability testing. And what a lot that I learned from them is really focus on behavior. There is a think aloud protocol, but watch what people do, figure out where they get tripped up on tasks, can they get from point A to B, and what's stopping them,
Hmm.
right? And so I have that on one side of my brain, but then I have on my other side of my brain, I'm really interested in what people think about this.
Yeah.
Is it compelling? Is it useful? What is it? How does it reflect on the brand? And uh, the best practice from usability testing would say, don't ask people for their opinion necessarily or what they think. Don't ask, what do you think
Right.
of this homepage? That doesn't really get you anything. So I challenged myself to say, um, there's got to be some other structure or some way to do this, some way to leverage these one-on-one conversations, early informative research, so that we can get at the questions that our clients have, like, which direction should we go, which idea is going to resonate most. If we are using a metaphor or an example in the interface, does that make sense to people or
Hmm.
not?
Yeah.
Less about, can they get from point A to point B, and are there usability bugs. So that's really the impetus for this kind of usefulness testing or value assessment. Concept resonance is another term I like to use sometimes
Yeah.
with clients. Are the ideas going to make sense?
Yep.
And but that said, what I did take from some of those teachers and some of the protocols is that you can't just wing it, right? You have to have some type of structure. You can't just ask, what do you think of this?
Right.
That's not going to be helpful because it might not get at what you want, and it's going to be very preference based. So that was the impetus for thinking about this and the content of my chapter.
Yep. Yep. No, that's wonderful. And I remember us chatting about this back in like 2011. I think that's when we presented at UXPA Boston on this. And the folks that we learned from were very strict in their way of thinking about usability and the functionality. And as you said, getting from point A to point B. And there was this opportunity to get that additional deep qualitative data. And part of what we do as researchers is to maximize the ROI of research, right? We want the money spent to maximize the time we have with participants. So sure, we can do some usability, but maybe we also get at other things like usefulness.
Yeah, and I think what's unique, maybe not unique, might be a strong word, but some people might say, well, it sounds like just formative research,
Mm,
and you're doing in-depth interviews, and you talk to people and maybe
right.
get an understanding of what they value or what their current flows are, what pain points are, and all that's valid. Um, what I found is that in an agile world, in a world where people like to kind of react to things, um, there's an opportunity to bring early sketches and early ideas to those formative in-depth user interviews. And
Totally.
so instead of just having an interview that is let's just talk, using a design artifact to help really dive deeper and help inspire uh, the participant to kind of think of other things or have ideas or react to something. It's a lot easier for them, I found, to react to something. And so if we're doing a design workshop early in the process and we have some ideas, maybe different ideas, let's take those and assess the usefulness or the value with customers one on one.
Yep. Yep. Do you have any examples of when this was particularly useful, as it were? Where there was a project where you found this to be instrumental?
Yeah, I mean, it comes across. It happens a lot, I would
Okay.
say. Um, I think back of a project you and I worked on. Actually, we were working for a music service, and they were considering a new business model. Right,
Yep.
that was um, maybe couples might listen together.
Right.
And what does that look like? What does that feel? And there's a couple different ideas. Do they create playlists together, or do they are they inspired by, your taste versus my tastes? And so we had some design artifacts and some ideas of, option A or option B or option C. And we were able to sit down with those people one on one and get a sense of through their own storytelling
Hmm.
and through their own reaction to the ideas that we put in front of them, certain interface ideas, we were able to use that to launch questions about which things they might use or not,
Yep.
and why.
Yep.
I'm working on another project right now, actually, that is for veterans and connecting them with other veterans and peer support and helping them manage things um, post deployment. And there's a couple different ways that could go, right? There's different aspects of community or connecting them with different events. And so we're doing exactly that. We have some early stage prototypes and ideas, and we are looking for usability feedback, but also for which parts of this is going to resonate or what are some unforeseen considerations that we wouldn't have addressed just thinking about this ourselves. That's the
Yep.
power of testing and user research, but doing it early in the development process such that we're focusing in the direction or the concept where this thing needs to go.
Yep. Yep.
So,
And you mentioned earlier that we can't just sit down and ask folks, what do you think? How else can we get at that? What other questions can we be asking of folks during these usefulness studies?
right. So that's what I've been constantly trying to think about as I do these studies is what types of structures. I'm a big believer in having a structure, and I'm very curious and about different interview techniques or
Mm,
structures for sometimes for the reason to have something that we can all rally around and to have a structure so that it doesn't go off the rails and just what do you think about this or
yep.
how's the homepage. A couple of things that I applied, not necessarily all the time, but depending on the nature of the project and the concept that we're testing. I do like to start with a lot of storytelling.
Hmm.
before we even get to the design artifact.
Yep.
Have the participants tell stories. This gets at the pain points. And then I'll reflect back on those stories as we go through the prototype or the concept and say, thinking back on that story that you told about how you had trouble connecting with that other veteran before,
Yep.
to what extent do you think this would help or not help in that? And so connecting your questions in the prototype walkthrough to the stories, I think is a big piece of that.
Yep.
Yeah. So another technique that I like to use is uh, instead of asking people what they think of something,
Hmm.
I ask them to describe it in adjectives, in
Hmm.
words. And so this is inspired by the Microsoft product reaction cards.
Yep.
If anybody's heard of that method, and the idea there is to force people or to have participants really try to articulate what this feels like to them or what this means to them uh, in adjectives, and not just do you like it or do you not like it. And then what we can do is we can reflect on the adjectives they're using and compare that to what we were intending the concept to do.
Right.
If this concept was meant to be uh, connecting people, do we get that vibe in terms of how they're describing it and the adjectives that they're using? Or do they describe it in another way? And if so, that's insightful for us.
Yep.
So,
How are you going about analyzing that data? How once you collect this information, how are you sorting through it and finding those trends?
well, if we're talking about some of the story aspect to things, what I try to do is code the intent of the story or the purpose or the pain point that it's talking about.
Yep.
What's the theme there? And then I have a comparison for uh, what people think of the concept uh, according to that theme.
Yep.
Similar with adjectives and words to use to describe it. I have very explicit questions around that, and I capture those adjectives or the voice.
Yep.
Another variation of that is I might ask, if this concept were a person, how would you describe this person?
Hmm.
Right. So it's kind of putting some characterization to it, and I'll code those as well. Collect those examples and use those with the team to say this is getting a feel of a really helpful, supportive person. So that's good. Or this concept is getting the theme of it feels too much like shopping to them
Hmm.
for whatever reason. I'm using that as a
Sure.
weird example, but that helps articulate that with the team.
Hmm. Great.
Yep.
Any other thoughts about your chapter before we move on to a piece of advice for listeners?
Well, I think with regards to the chapter, the idea is to think, when you're doing formative research,
Hmm.
to think of structures and methods that can help you with the ultimate outcome and make some decisions about the direction of the product. So don't just go into it saying we're going to do interviews. Have some way to leverage a design artifact, a concept, a prototype early on, but do it in a thoughtful way that has some structure that will guide you towards some decision making.
Yep.
So a lot of formative research I find is we learn about people and their needs, and that's helpful. But we need to when we need to accelerate it, which is often, use that design artifact to get you further down the path of design. You can always do more detailed usability testing and fine tune certain interaction mechanisms and labels and things like that later. Uh, but you can combine. I think the overall lesson is you can combine that formative, in-depth research, needs analysis with some concept testing
Hmm.
and moving things along in your project.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that structure? Is there a little bit more about the way you approach a given study, and the structure of how you approach it?
Yeah, I'd say that most all of the studies that I do ha- in this early concepting phase have a very explicit opening section
Hmm.
that is about that needs analysis, is about the storytelling, that is about setting the context and priming the participant to be critical in their thinking.
Mm,
A lot of what do you find when you put a concept in front of people is they might be inclined to say, "Oh, this is cool," or "I hadn't thought about this. Looks good,"
yep.
right? And so I think about having a structure and using that opening interview and discussion to really prime them to be critical, so that I can in a constructive way. I don't mean to say that I
Sure.
just want them to be negative, but I want them to use a good lens, their own perspective, to really evaluate this concept.
Hmm.
And so, if I have them tell a story, or if I have them relate a pain point they're dealing with, I'll mark those down in the outset, and then I'll refer back to them as we're going through the concept. I'll allow them to have their own experience and to say, "Oh, that's cool," or "This might be helpful in this way." But then I'll explicitly go back and say, "Well, remember you told this story, or remember you said this pain point was here, or remember you said that you used some other app or other experience that wasn't helping you in this way.
Yeah.
How would you compare that to what you're seeing here?" And so it puts it in their own, they have a hard time uh, kind of going back on themselves and say, "Oh, yeah, you were right. Yeah, so maybe I should be more critical. Maybe you could do it this way or that way." And so um, leveraging that first opening set of questions and referring back to them is a key part of this usability, this usefulness testing.
Yep. Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Like setting the stage for them. And people don't like to contradict themselves. So if they get out
Exactly.
that honest feedback in the beginning, comparing it is just wonderful. That's great.
Yeah, and you need to do it in a friendly way. I'm
Of
not saying,
course.
"Well, you said this before, so now you can't say that this is the best thing since sliced bread."
Right.
Um, but doing that in a constructive way.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Great. So thanks for all that. That was really helpful in terms of how to get this done. Next up, love to hear a piece of advice for listeners, whether it's breaking into UX or continuing in UX. What piece of advice would you like to convey to folks?
I think the big thing for me is to uh, talk about UX. And so I'm doing this podcast here, right?
Yep.
You're doing this, and we've been active in the professional community. That has really helped me in my career, because it forces me to be critical of my own thinking. It it also forces me to have a vocabulary. A lot of people have opinions about user experience, design, apps. Everybody has it. It's ubiquitous in all of our lives, right?
Yep.
And so everybody's got an opinion. And the way that we can differentiate ourselves as UX professionals is to have an understanding of the rationale, is to be able to describe why something works or why something doesn't work, to be able to describe and give a sense of trends, or articulate why something is working for the target audience or not.
Hmm.
And so continually talking about that just reinforces that skill.
Yep.
And so, if you think that if you're going to be a UX designer and be in Figma and Sketch all the time, and that's rewarding, and figuring out problems in that way is helpful. You're not going to be a great designer if you can't articulate to the rest of your team, to the marketing person, to the developer, why something is working or not. If
Yep.
you can't do that, they're going to have their own opinions, and it's just going to be a big mess.
Yep.
Same thing for researchers. If you can't, um, you can do the best research that you can do, and you can have this vision of what's working and what's not. But if you can't articulate that to your stakeholders, it's just not going to be as valuable. And so, whether that be leading a workshop with your team, doing a talk at a conference, being the presenter of research, whatever it is, just continuing to practice articulating the rationale, findings, and important concepts to others, I think is really helpful.
Yep. And something that jumped out to me there is the vocabulary. The vocabulary that one group uses may be very different from another group, but you may be talking about very similar things. So learning others' vocabulary helps with that storytelling.
Yeah, I think of it, and you have to adapt to other people's vocabulary for sure. You have to understand business language or
Totally.
technology language and things like that. At the same time, you also have to throw in just a couple of one or two key UX terms or phrases. So I wouldn't talk about cognitive load too much,
Right.
but every once in a while, it helps to differentiate you and show you that you have some background in the academic underpinnings of this, and what's the background of the psychology
Sure.
of how people come to here, or with color theory, how things work, or grids, or whatever. If you have a little bit of that, it can help separate you. You don't want to overwhelm people with that
Yep.
stuff, with the UX buzzword bingo, but a little bit doesn't hurt.
Yeah. Dropping the word, helps build cred a little bit there.
That's exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and
Yeah.
it's legit too, right? And so
Totally.
keep studying all that stuff. You know, you and I, we went through a master's degree program. You don't always have to do that, but I think forcing yourself to learn some of the psychological principles that are involved, the visual attention, the visual theory, all that stuff is helpful.
Yep.
I'd say also on the process side as well. There's a lot of process. That's what I've run across a lot these days. Is like, okay, we got this big team and we've been talking about things a lot. Um, if UX people can be thoughtful about the implications of running things in an agile framework, or what innovation practices are, those are all helpful things to talk about as well
Yep.
and to articulate.
Yep.
So,
Great. Well, thanks for all of that. Is there anything I didn't ask you about today that you were hoping to convey to folks?
um, you didn't ask me about the book. In my opinion of the book, I think it's great that we can offer these tidbits,
Hmm.
right? And there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I love the how we can share these in a compilation like this.
Yep.
So much knowledge all in one condensed space, and it can lead you to different things that you can explore more.
Yep.
So for those listening, use the book for that reason. I think it's an awesome concept. So
Great. Great. We're very proud of the way it came out, and as you said, it's just those little tidbits to go so you can go off and go deeper elsewhere. Yeah,
right, there's more to be found on each of those things, and
that's
use
for
this
sure.
as your entry point into a lot of different topics. So thanks to you, Dan, for putting it together.
Oh, my pleasure. It was wonderful. Well, great. So, thank you so much for joining me today, Mike. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about your chapter about usefulness and desirability. So, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. And if anybody's interested in following up on this topic, I'd love to connect with them. I think it's like this mix of, is this slapping in your face obvious that you should be asking questions about this stuff? Or is there a structure? Is there more to it? And so I'd love to
Hmm.
continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Great. So, reach out to Mike if you want to continue this conversation with him. Otherwise, thanks for listening, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. You've been listening to the 97 UX Things podcast, a companion to the book 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know, published by O'Reilly and available at your local bookshop. All book royalties go to UX nonprofits, as will any funds raised by this podcast. The theme music is Moisturize the Situation by Consider the Source. Joshua Berlin is the podcast transcript editor, and I'm your host and book editor, Dan Berlin. Please remember to find the needs in your community and fill them with your best work. Thanks for listening.